Why do we have so much poverty in America?
Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with BASEDPolitics. Welcome back to my show, Hannah Explains It All, where every week I'm helping you better understand the world around you and the public policy decisions that inform it. This week, we're addressing a pressing question I continuously see on the internet of why are Americans so poor? I don't necessarily think that's the case, but we're going to dig into that and see what the facts actually show. Before we do that though, I just want to give a quick explainer for why I was randomly MIA last week. I did make a note in my community post, but in case you didn't see it, my Facebook was hacked. And not only was it was hacked in this very elaborate scheme where the hackers pretended to be a producer with a popular podcast that I was going to be on. And they told me that this interview would take place on Facebook Live. And in the process, when I was trying to join the live, they sent me a bad link, I guess, and were able to take over my Facebook. Now, fortunately, I had some contacts at Facebook. I was actually able to recover the account, which is a rarity from what I've heard. But in the meantime, my life went to total shutdown mode last week. I had to make sure I was protecting all accounts. I was worried about financials. It was really scary. I know this might be a little bit dramatic, but I actually really felt like somebody had broken in my house and mugged me. Really disgusting. I'm very thankful I got it back. Thank you to those of you who helped me behind the scenes. I will leave it with this note, which is that I increasingly want to know why police do not solve crimes like this versus spending all of their time locking people up for weed. But that's a debate for another day. For now, let's jump back into the actual material for this week. And if you like the content, don't forget to leave me a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. On platforms like YouTube and TikTok, I am seeing a growing trend where people are telling one another that they need to leave America, that America is super crappy, that your quality of life is inferior. There's a whole genre of content creators who have allegedly left the United States and are trying to influence people to do the same by showcasing their lives overseas. And across the board, the general message that's being pushed on people in these videos is that Americans are poor, you don't have a very good quality of life, and if you were to leave, it would be better elsewhere. But when you really stop and think about it, the facts don't exactly line up here. The reality is we have more people trying to come here than we do people trying to leave. And not only do we have more people trying to come here, they are often risking their lives to do so. Never have you ever heard of somebody needing to go swim with sharks in order to escape America. So while we can criticize things about living here, and I certainly do, I use this channel and this platform, and particularly the show, to point out why things are getting worse here and how the government is responsible for that. But what I don't want us to do is start looking at everything negatively or totally lose our perspective. Yes, there are really bad decisions being made that many people support in this country that are leading to a worse quality of life. And if people don't wise up, it will continue to get worse. But that being said, I still firmly believe that the United States of America is the absolute best country to live in, hands down. And if you disagree with me, I have to believe you haven't really done very much traveling or research. Let's roll one of these videos so you can get a better understanding of exactly what I'm talking about.
An average European lives a better life than an average American, even though the United States is the wealthiest country in history. Here's why. Despite the fact that the United States has produced most billionaires and millionaires, most Americans take huge debts to go to college, barely afford health care, and struggle to pay their credit card bills. Meanwhile, Europeans have free healthcare, free education, and work fewer hours than Americans. Europeans pay taxes for the government to provide free education and healthcare, while Americans pay taxes to support the largest and most powerful military in history. Europe spends pennies on defense while enjoying the same defense benefits as the U.S. While the U.S. is the wealthiest country in the world, they are still debating in every election how to make health care and education more affordable. If you don't believe me, just follow the 2024 presidential election.
Propaganda. That's all this is. It's everywhere. This is propaganda. And I firmly think that's one reason TikTok and other social media platforms are pushing it, because it's telling people as a whole, you need to have a more progressive set of policies governing your country in order to have a higher quality of life. You can see that in this video perfectly clear. Now, the content creator doesn't show their face, but they say that though Americans are wealthier and it's a wealthier country, they have a worse quality of life than people who live in Europe. A worse quality of life based on what metrics? That seems a little bit subjective, but from the video, it seems what he's trying to say is that Americans have a worse quality of life based on a number of features in Europe that we don't have access to.
The fact that the United States has produced most billionaires and millionaires, most Americans take huge debts to go to college, barely afford health care, and struggle to pay their credit card bills.
So, Let's break down each of these things and see if that's actually true. Do Americans take on debt to go to college? Yes, they do. And I have explained why that has increasingly become more expensive ad nauseum. If you've yet to see it, please go watch my original series of Based and check out the episode on higher education and how it became so expensive, how the government broke it. It is very illuminating. But as I said previously, we can acknowledge that there is a growing problem in the United States without getting super hyperbolic, which is what he's doing. Yes, Americans are having to take on more debt than they should for college. Yes, the price of college has gotten ridiculously high. And yes, the value in a college education is falling. But these are by no means issues only the US is having. According to the OECD, the average student debt on graduation in the academic year of 2019 to 2020 was £51,367 in England. It's actually England and not the United States in first place for worst student debt, by the way. Furthermore, it was £27,491 in Norway, £14,907 in Denmark, £14,807 in Finland. You get the picture. People aren't coming out debt-free from those schools either. In comparison, in 2019 to 2020, the average student loan amount borrowed for a 4-year bachelor's degree was $30,500 in the US. So less than England and only slightly more than some of these other European countries. Worth noting, though, is the fact that our salaries are also much higher than theirs. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor, the average U.S. annual salary in Q4 of 2023 was $59,384. Average annual salaries for single employees in Europe were £26,136. Not to mention, they pay far higher taxes on their salaries than we do as well. And what do they get for it? Free college, free healthcare, free childcare. I don't know about you, but I'm not willing to take a salary that's like half of what the average is here in the US and pay more taxes on it just for these services. You can still find much cheaper ways of obtaining a college degree in the United States. By the way, you also can pick from a number of fields that pay very well and don't even require a college degree. These are choices people are making to go to more expensive schools, live on campus, live away from their families, and take on debt. Should the price of college be lower? Yes, and it absolutely would be if the government was not involved in the picture. But the fact that Americans are carrying a pretty high amount of student debt actually has a lot more to do with choices than it does anything else. And I, for one, am in no way convinced that it's worth paying a much higher tax rate and getting a lower salary in order to get 4 free years of college, which, as you see, is still not even free because people still have to pay for room and board, living expenses, books, and other things that drive up the price of an actual college degree. Next, he says Americans can barely afford healthcare. This is, of course, a very obvious attempt to get universal healthcare. That is their end goal. It's always been their end goal. And it is one of the worst ideas on the table. I made a whole video in this series a few weeks ago looking at Canada's universal healthcare system and how poorly it shapes up next to the United States. And I honestly could do that for just about every country in the EU as well. Again, healthcare in America has gotten more expensive than it should be if we were in an actual capitalist free market system. And that's because the government has gotten increasingly involved in healthcare. You'll tend to notice that whenever the government gets involved in a sector of the economy, it goes to shit and things get more expensive. I also have an old episode of Based examining exactly what happened in our healthcare system over the past 100 years that have led to the prices we're currently living with. And guess what? It has everything to do with the government and their policies. Go check it out. But while American healthcare is more expensive than it should be, there's really nothing showing that Europeans are getting better healthcare or that it's even that much more available to them. In fact, across the board, their free healthcare systems are collapsing. And because of that, many people who live there also have to carry private insurance. They travel overseas, often to the United States, to get basic care, or they simply die waiting for basic services they should be able to obtain, but that their systems can no longer provide because they are collapsing under the weight of a government-run system. They can't get enough providers. They aren't paying people what they're worth to practice. They have tremendous overcrowding. The money's being mismanaged. In France, Slovenia, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Croatia, over half the population carries private coverage. Plus, they also pay a ton of money in taxes to get their free healthcare that's becoming virtually useless. I'll just give you a few examples here to back myself up, but for the love of God, before you start pushing for universal healthcare here, please go do actual research into what's happening in these systems abroad. Because this is, again, straight propaganda. Here's CNN. Why is Britain's health service, a much-loved national treasure, falling apart? And within this article is a chart where they note that half of emergency department patients waited more than 4 hours to receive care. 4 hours at the emergency room? That is life and death. Here's another one at breaking point or already broken, the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. And an independent, they note that a leading medic is warning the NHS is collapsing. It is flashing red on almost all performance measures. Like, no thanks. You can find the same thing in France. France's healthcare crisis, what you should know, lack of staff, burnout, medicine supply issues are among primary problems plaguing France's healthcare. Here's another one on France. On life support, can France's struggling healthcare system be saved? I'm gonna bet no. Let's go to Spain. Spain's deep crisis continues. Cuts in pharmaceutical spending, doctors' jobs threats, A&E closures, non-payments to medical suppliers. Like, we could go all day here. Here's The Guardian. A ticking time bomb. Healthcare under threat across Western Europe. The government cannot make things free. You are a child if you think that that is what's happening. What they can do is tax you into oblivion, mismanage your resources, cause prices to skyrocket, push everybody to flee from actually working as a supplier or provider in that field because it sucks working for government or government-run institutions, and leave you with a hot mess. It is delusional to look at the United States healthcare system and see the problems that have been created over the past 100 years thanks to government involvement and think the solution is to give the government total control. Wake up. This stuff grinds my gears. You're going to get people killed with these kind of ridiculous ideas. Okay, on to his next point. He says Americans struggle to pay their credit cards. Now, I did some research into this, and it does seem that the United States tends to carry more consumer credit debt, and it also just seems that Americans use credit cards at a much higher rate than many European countries. I was curious for why that is, since we are, as a whole, much richer than they are, and I found some interesting information on it. According to NerdWall, an uptick in consumer spending is often seen as a sign of economic development, which means that as countries become wealthier, credit card use increases. And they note that, for instance, China's economy has been growing at breakneck pace for years, and so has the use of credit cards. In 2011, Chinese citizens charged an average of $297 to their cards, which might not seem like that much, but it's a 67.7% jump from 2005. They also note another example of a developing country that has significantly increased its credit card usage is Brazil. In the past 5 years, the availability of consumer credit has increased substantially in South America's largest nation. The average Brazilian is now spending 20% of her monthly income on debt repayment. So a lot of this is a cultural phenomenon, and it's something that Americans need to get a hold of, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's because life is worse here. What it actually means is that we probably have more opportunities, more things that glisten. Also, when people live in a closer proximity to wealth, they are exposed to more things they can spend their money on. You see a keeping up with the Joneses effect. I'm not excusing this, but this is a responsibility personal problem. Americans need to relearn to live within their means. I think oftentimes we start talking about how life is getting more expensive, and it is, again, thanks to government spending and progressive policies that have led to inflation and to shortages when it comes to things like houses. But two things can be true at once. Things are getting more expensive, but also a lot of Americans are having lifestyle creep where they think they need to have bigger houses, bigger cars, newer furniture. They are living well beyond their means, and just because you can access a credit card does not mean that you should. Next, this guy says that Europeans work far more hours than Americans, which is a very popular talking point. But do they? According to my research, in 2022, the usual working week for people aged 20 to 64 in the EU averaged 37.5 hours. The longest working weeks were recorded in Greece at 41 hours, Poland at 40 hours, and Romania and Bulgaria at 40.2 hours. Considering the average work week in America is 40 hours, that doesn't seem like that big of a difference. On top of that, it doesn't even look like the vast majority of Americans are working 40 hours a week anymore. As you can see from this chart, it's really people that have less education with no college that tend to work over 8 hours a day. I find this talking point really frustrating because it also tends to go hand in hand with people who will say that Europe has a better quality of life that they offer to people when they're working. They'll say they get more vacation days, they get more time off, they work less hours. All of it to say you in America are working too hard and you're so oppressed and poor you. But in reality, it's because of our work ethic that we are wealthier and that we have a better quality of life than they do. Again, I don't know, have you people never been to Europe? Because I have, and it's kind of crappy. Like, honestly, most of the time when I'm moving around Europe, it feels kind of third world to me. Their airports are tiny. They often don't have basic heat or air going on. You do have to walk absolutely everywhere, which can have its benefits, but it also has a lot of serious negatives. Their housing tends to be much older and much smaller. They tend to own fewer clothes, fewer things in general. Their quality of life as a whole is not the same as what most Americans see as a standard. And that's absolutely fine. If you want to work fewer hours and have a simpler life, I get it. And that's perfectly fine, by the way. If you want to work fewer hours and have your life not revolve around work and therefore have a simpler existence, that's totally fine. That's your prerogative. Couldn't be me. but I'm fine if you choose that. But newsflash, you can choose to live simply in America, to live more rurally, to live away from expensive city areas. I don't understand this thing of like you have to work nonstop to live in America. No, you don't. You have to work hard to have a really good life and to keep up with the Joneses and to access all the things Americans have become very accustomed to accessing. But that's a preference. That's something you choose to do or don't choose to do. It just so happens that most people in Europe choose not to do that. They don't have the same work ethic. They don't have the same culture. They don't have the same opportunities. And that's why the go-getters still want to come here. Because yes, you might have a decent baseline living in Europe, but you can't really go much further than that. You're pretty boxed in. You don't have the ability to move up classes. You don't have the chance to become a billionaire. You don't see companies opening left and right. You see that here in America. To address his last point that in Europe their taxes go to social services versus military, I think that's the one fair point he makes. The US still spends more on its military than over 144 other nations combined. But the reason that Europe doesn't have to spend as much on its defense is because we're picking up the pay tab. And you should be mad about that. I'm furious about it. I absolutely think we need to see tremendous cuts to our military-industrial complex. I think it's a disgusting operation. It's very corrupt. I can't stand it. Libertarians have been fighting this for 50 years. Join us. I'm not even in favor of really paying taxes for very much, but if we are going to pay them, they certainly should be going back to the American people. And I think that's something that people on both the left and right should be able to come together over. I'm not a Trump fan by any means, but this was also a big part of his MAGA message and why it was so successful and resonated with so many people when he said we should be putting America first. We should stop sending our tax dollars overseas. We should stop sending our military overseas. And again, this is something we can come together on. Let's do it. But all of this to say, there is nothing really backing up the notion that Europeans have it so much better than we do. Poverty rates do vary between U.S. states every bit as much as they do across various European countries, so it's important to keep that perspective. But a study in 2016 said that poverty rates in the EU range from 6 to 16% compared to 7 to 29% between U.S. states that same year. So yes, there are fluctuations when it comes to poverty across various states and European countries, but all in all, there's not that vast of a difference. Where there is a vast difference is in how we tax our poor people. Taxes as a whole are higher in Europe, and they also include a VAT tax, value-added tax, which is basically like a sales tax. And that can be upwards of 27%. Here in the States, having a sales tax of 9 to 10% is pretty much the highest in the country. Furthermore, their top tax brackets on earnings range from 40% to over 55% in France, Germany, and Spain. Whereas in the US, we're capped at around 37 to 38% most of the time. Now, what does this mean as a whole? It means if you're poor or even middle class in Europe, you're paying a lot more of the tax burden than you would be here in the United States. Contrary to progressive talking points, the United States actually has a very progressive tax system. In fact, the top 10% of households in the U.S. earn about 33.5% of all income, but they pay 45.1% of income-related taxes, including Social Security and Medicare taxes. So the rich are absolutely subsidizing the poor here in the United States. As this piece points out, that's actually the most progressive income tax share of any OECD nation. In Germany, the top 10% earn 29.2% of the income and pay 31.2% of income-related taxes. The French top 10% earn 25.5% of the income and pay 28% of the income taxes. So if the top earners pay a smaller share of income taxes in other countries, that means everybody else pays a greater share. In the United States, the top 10% of income earners pay 7.6% of GDP in income-related taxes, and the bottom 90% pay 9.2%. In Germany, the top 10% of earners pay a similar 7.4% of GDP in income-based taxes, but the remaining 90% in Germany pay 16.4% of GDP, 77% more than the United States. In France, the top 10% pay 7.1% of GDP. The remaining 90% of taxpayers pay 18.2% of GDP, 97% more than in the US. Even in Sweden, the top 10% of earners pay only 5.9% of GDP in income-related taxes, 22% less than the US. The other 90% of earners pay 16.3%, 77% more than in the United States. So who's oppressing the poor again? It's not us. Additionally, the United States collects only 35.8% of all tax revenues from sources other than income, such as sales and excise taxes, the smallest share of any country in the OECD. Consumption-based taxes tend to impact people more equally because everybody has to pay sales tax on a given item, as one example. When you focus on taxing income versus things like sales, you get an unequal tax distribution system where the rich are paying far more than the poor. The people trying to tell you that America is so mean to the poor, we don't care about our poor people, are grifters. They're mostly just people trying to build up an influencer brand for themselves by selling you an aesthetic that doesn't actually hold up in real life. Take this young woman as one example.
I live and work in Spain, making roughly 1,000 euros a month, which in America is nothing, but in Spain is more than enough to live. I only work 16 hours a week, and I'm able to afford a super nice apartment in the city center of Madrid. Food costs me 20 euros a week. My electric bill is like 30 euros a month. I don't have to worry about gas or a car payment or insurance because the public transportation system is so world class that you don't even need a car at all. Madrid is like the New York of Spain, except if you were living in the city center of New York, you'd have to be making literally at least $5,000 a month, and that's extremely lowballing it. Just their way of life in general, like, is so much more relaxed and just taking time to enjoy life rather than just working constantly. They literally have a siesta in the middle of the day where they take 3 hours to go nap or go to a coffee shop to hang out with friends. Like, the American mind cannot fathom. It's just crazy to me because, like, you've been told growing up your whole life that America is the best country in the world. That's just so far from the truth. And it's, like, very obvious how much worse it is now that I've gotten out.
What I liked best about this video full of absolute hogwash was the comments. Let's go to a few of them. Victoria says, I live in Madrid and make 1,000 euros a month and I am barely getting by. ISA says, are we living in the same Madrid? Gio says she's exaggerating. You can't live comfortably on 1,000 euro in Madrid. Michelle Rebecca said, while I'm all for living abroad, you have to mention that the program you're working under is the reason why you can work 16 hours for 1,000 euros. We're able to thrive only because of the privilege of coming from English-speaking countries and the high demand Spain has for needing teachers. She says also 1,000 euros the base, but what she isn't mentioning is that a lot of us had to work extra jobs to afford to live comfortably. Shawu said, a quick Google search will tell you a nice apartment in Madrid is 1,000 to 2,000 euros, so I don't know how you do that on $1,000 a month. She says, my rent is $700 a month, and most people I know pay even less than that. The exact same places would be $2,000 plus in a comparable American city. But there is no comparable American city. She's basically trying in her video to compare prices you would pay in Manhattan, which is obviously one of the very most expensive places you could possibly live in the entire world, not to mention just the US, to where she's currently living. Furthermore, it sounds like she probably has quite a few roommates, which she is conveniently leaving out. You can get rent for $700 a month in the United States too. It just means that you probably don't live in like the hippest part of town in the biggest, coolest, trendiest city, and you probably have roommates. I did it for many years in Nashville. Here's another one that says, we need receipts because I lived in Madrid 10 years ago and 1,000 euros was not enough back then. Sarah said, girl, what Madrid are you staying at? Because I can't live alone with 1,000 euros. 20 euros a week for groceries? What do you eat, Error? Like, your story absolutely does not wash, honey, whatsoever. So I don't think her financial piece is up front. I think she's probably doing a lot of other things to make that living situation possible, which again, you can do in the United States too. It's just that most people don't want to, for good reason. And the fact that the vast majority of Spain is fine living like that speaks volumes about the state their country is in. According to Human Rights Watch, 27.8% of the population in Spain is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. In comparison, only 12.4% of Americans now live in poverty, according to 2022 data from the US Census. Their country is impoverished, and it's because they sleep half the day and they don't work. Let's go to one more completely unhinged video to wrap things up.
Americans are so broke and they don't even realize it. I always get Americans tell me, oh, but people in Mexico only make $20 a day. You can get a full meal here for $2. The metro in Mexico City costs 5 pesos, which is like 25 cents. I can go to the market right now and buy 3 kilos of mangoes for like $2. Yeah, people make less money here, but the cost of living is also lower. Americans think that everywhere is like the US. Now, check this out. Let's say you live in the US and you make $3,500 a month after taxes. I'm being generous. Rent, $2,000. Car payment, $500. Car insurance, $200. Health insurance, $200. Phone bill, $100. Wi-Fi bill, $50. Light bill, $150. Water bill, $100. What's the point of making more money if you don't get to keep any of it? Who cares if you make $4,000 a month if you don't get to keep any of it? 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and that includes half of 6-figure earners. 80% of you guys are in debt and don't own anything, and half of you guys don't even have $500 in your savings account. But let's call other countries poor and let's call other people poor. Living paycheck to paycheck your whole life and being in debt your whole life should be considered poverty, but it's not. And I know this is going to hurt a lot of Americans, but it's the truth. The US system wants you to spend every waking moment of your life working and paying into a system that will never benefit you. Slaving away your whole life just to be retired for a measly 10 years. At least here in Mexico, we own our things, we own our houses, we own our cars, we're not in debt. But anyways, that's a story for another day. Let me know what you guys think.
For the record, Mexicans remain the largest group of immigrants in the United States, accounting for about 24% of the 45.3 million foreign-born residents in the country as of 2021. So I'm going to say that the vast majority of Mexicans do not agree with his analysis. I have so many problems with his video too, because he's basically trying to say, don't act like you're wealthy when you're mismanaging your money. The fact is, you still have more opportunity and more access to wealth here in the United States than you do in virtually any other country. If you are not taking advantage of that, that is a you problem. We can say that things are getting worse. We can say that things are becoming more expensive. We can say that those opportunities are diminishing thanks to government involvement in the market, and they are, while still not trying to say that what we have here is not good. It is amazing. It is why people risk their lives to try to come here. And what I think is so interesting is that the immigrants who come here in that population, they don't seem to have a hard time cutting it. They don't have a problem living with multiple roommates. They don't have a problem working multiple jobs. They don't have a problem doing physical labor. They don't have a problem paying their bills. They are grateful for the chance to come here and work and provide for themselves. And the problem that he's talking about is that Americans are increasingly not grateful. They're not willing to hustle. They're not willing to live within their means. As he even points out when he says people are living paycheck to paycheck, a lot of those are high income earners. It's really inexcusable if you don't have $1,000 saved in the bank. I just don't understand that mentality. And I'm somebody who has definitely worked my way up the ladder. I did not make a lot of money when I was first getting started in adulthood. I came out during the Great Recession. Times were tough. And I worked multiple jobs when I needed to. I had roommates when I needed to. I lived outside of like the trendy, cool areas of a given town when I needed to. These are things you have to do to make ends meet. I think what we actually have happening in America is an entitlement problem where people think that they are entitled to have the big house, the fancy car, the nice job, not having to work 2 jobs. That's the American dream. You are entitled to pursuing it. You're not entitled to just get it once you pop out of college. I actually saw another video on TikTok. I can't find, I'm so mad about it, but it was a man who worked in real estate and he was talking about how people are saying houses are so unaffordable now. And yes, many of them are, but there are still plenty of affordable houses. They're just probably not where you want to live. And maybe they require a 40-minute commute, but people's perceptions of what a starter home should look like are not realistic. And I think that's a lot of the problem here is that people are not realistic about what life is going to have to be like. Yes, you're going to have to hustle. You're going to have to work hard. You're going to have to be smart. You're going to have to go above and beyond. You were never promised otherwise. It's so entitled to think that just because you were born in America, everything should be handed to you when people are desperate to come here to access the same opportunities you're taking for granted. So no, I don't buy this argument that life is so much better outside of the United States or that we have it so bad here. The people who are trying to sell you that are really trying to sell you an agenda. And that agenda is either their own grift or it's a set of progressive policies that will continue to make everything worse. And I think that that's the real problem we have. It's not a poverty problem. It is a responsibility problem where Americans are not taking responsibility for themselves and their financial situations. And they're also not taking responsibility for their own involvement in their political system and taking the time to inform themselves on what public policies would actually lead to greater access to wealth, to an easier quality of life. And instead, they're falling for gimmicks like this. All right, guys, that's a wrap. Leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you next week. If you like this episode, don't forget to check out others in my series, Hannah Explains It All, here. And you can check out my other weekly show, Histrionics, here.